This is session 2. Welcome back, and great job for showing up and doing this work to make changes that are going to be important to your life. I guarantee you will not regret the effort that you're making when you see the great results that you get. Let's spend just a moment to review what we talked about in the last session. We covered what your motivation for change is. Last session 2, we talked about the very first concept that I gave you, and it's this idea that our thoughts create emotions and then that drives actions. I hope too that you're doing the exercises that we gave you at the end of the last session. They're really important to help us develop the awareness of what's going on in our mind. Once we get that, then we're in a much better position to make changes that will stick. Let me give you a little preview of where we're headed today. We're going to start by looking at our worst reactions. Those times that we say or do things that we almost instantly regret, that damage our relationships and get us into trouble. In order to get some insight on those, we're going to have a short lesson in brain anatomy. So get ready for a biology lesson. And even though those reactions seem like they're instantaneous and there's nothing we can do about them, that's not exactly true. So I want to share with you a couple of techniques that will help you recognize when we're going down that path of having a bad reaction and stop it, hopefully sooner, so that we don't do the damage that maybe we've been doing. So that's what we're covering today. Let's get started. Let me tell you a story about the first time that I was arrested for domestic violence. It was an afternoon where my wife and I got into an argument, and that argument just continued to build and escalate. At one point, I remember going out to the garage and I saw a scooter there that one of my kids had, and I picked it up and I flung it against the wall. Of course, that crash in the garage was noticed by my wife, and she came out, and then we exchanged some more words. And at that point, I just took off after her and I ended up assaulting her. Now, this is not something that I'm proud of. In fact, this falls squarely into that category of things that we've done that we sincerely and deeply regret. And yet, here I was, acting and behaving in that way. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew that I could get into trouble for it with the law. I knew that it was damaging to our relationship. And in fact, I didn't want to hurt her. And still, I behaved that way. Upon reflection, I discovered that the emotion that I felt at that time was rage. Rage is that elevated level of anger. It's not just frustrated or upset or pissed. It is anger at a level that we don't even think straight. It's a very dangerous emotion and a state that all of us would be wise to avoid. We're going to talk more about rage and even lower levels of anger and how we can avoid those, because it's in those moments that we aren't thinking straight and that we do things that we later regret. Let me pause here and give you an opportunity for some reflection. What do you do when you feel angry? Do you walk away? Do you stay and argue? Or maybe it's some combination that you walk away, but then you come back and argue, or you start to argue, but eventually you walk away. Perhaps you just don't experience that much anger, and you're able to calmly and rationally talk through a conflict. A second question is, how often do you experience rage? That level of anger that just feels out of control, where we're not thinking clearly. Is it once or twice a year? Once or twice a month? Once or twice a week? or even once or twice a day. In order to better understand our reactions, including our rage reactions, we really need to dive in and understand a little bit about how our brain is put together, our brain anatomy, and how that all works. There's a region at the base of our brain called the limbic region, and it's really the part that's responsible for our reactions. If you've ever been to the doctor's office and they came in and they hit below your kneecap with one of those rubber hammers and your leg automatically kicks out, that's being driven by the base of your brain, the limbic region. Now, the limbic region is not very evolved. It has a very limited set of responses that it's capable of doing. Typically, it's either fight or flight. Sometimes this part of the brain is called our lizard brain because lizards, when they see a threat, they either fight, perhaps like T-Rexes used to do in the dinosaur era, or they flee, they scurry off. But there's not a lot of thinking that a lizard does. And when only our limbic brain is involved in our reactions, there's not a lot of thinking going on there either. There are a couple of small almond-sized, almond-shaped organs that are part of our limbic brain called the amygdala. The amygdala really are responsible for a couple of different things. First, they serve as our emotional memory. So anything that has happened to us in the past that was hurtful or scary or traumatic, the amygdala has recorded the pattern of what that incident was, and it remembers that. The second thing that the amygdala does is it serves as a router for all of the information coming into the brain. So whatever our eyes see or we hear or our senses pick up, it goes through the amygdala and it runs it past that emotional memory. Does this incident look like something that was scary or hurtful to me in the past? Now, if it wasn't, the amygdala continued to pass that information on to the cortex part, the upper part of our brain, where we do our thinking, we do our decision making, we use our memory and our value system to make judgments and to determine our next best course of action. On the other hand, if the amygdala perceives something that does look like it was something that was hurtful to us in the past, it was scary, it was damaging, the amygdala will route that information to the limbic system. It will alert that system to respond in that very quick fight or flight sort of way. So anytime there's an event that looks scary, that looks dangerous to our amygdala, it is routing it to our limbic system. It's not routing it to the thinking part of our brain. This is why some of that traditional advice that we might hear about what were you thinking when you did that bad thing, or you need to make a different decision, or just count to 10 during that moment. That part of the brain which remembers those strategies and can process and make a decision about what our response is going to be isn't involved at all in our reaction. The limbic system has hijacked it. It's called an amygdala hijack and has routed that to the part of our brain that is just going to respond. We're either going to flee or we're going to fight. And as you can imagine, those limited responses are usually not our best responses in a lot of situations, like having conflict with our partner. If our brains are wired for automatic reactions like this, what could we do to intervene with it? It may seem pretty hopeless. How do we go about rewiring our brain after all? The reality is it's not hopeless, and we have some opportunities to intervene before we go completely down that path of getting into a rage or into an emotional state where we are out of control. Part of the limbic region's response is to signal to the adrenal glands. These are glands that sit on top of our kidneys to dump adrenaline into our bloodstream. I'm betting a lot of you are familiar with adrenaline and what it does. It's that superpower hormone that allows us to lift up a car when there's a child trapped underneath, or leap a fence when we're being chased by a pack of vicious dogs. Adrenaline does other things in our body that we can notice, and those can become early warning signs that our limbic system is active and has kicked in. For one, we might feel our face is hot or flush, and that's because adrenaline is causing our heart to beat more quickly. In fact, we might actually be able to feel our heart beating more quickly, or our breathing becomes more shallow and faster. It could be that we feel this tightness in our chest or in our gut, or maybe we'll even notice that we're clenching our fists. These are all physiological signs that something has happened, our limbic system is trying to take over, and it's an early warning sign that we need to intervene before we continue down this path. There could be some warning signs that we have with our behavior as well. For example, if our words become critical or sarcastic or hurtful, that's a good warning sign. For me, I don't swear a lot, but when I notice that I am swearing, it's a good indication that I'm starting to become upset and I need to take notice. It could also be with our voice. Maybe the pitch changes or the volume changes and we're talking louder or even yelling. Sometimes we'll notice that we're just doing things differently. Maybe we're more animated, jumping up out of the chair and then sitting back down, or leaving the room but very shortly coming back into the room. Could be that our behavior, we're pounding a fist or slamming a door or just treating objects around us more roughly. Certainly throwing anything or kicking anything or punching anything is a really good indication that that anger has started to build and that the limbic system is probably driving our behavior much more than the rational parts of our brain. I encourage you to start noticing your reactions when you get upset. Maybe even think back in the past and try to reconstruct, what was it that I felt? Were there any of those warning signs, either the physiological ones like tense muscles or a warm face or clenching your fists, or maybe there were some behavioral ones that that I pounded the table or I slammed a door. Let me pause here and give you a chance to do some reflection about your early warning signs. Perhaps go back and think about incidents in the past where you got upset and start noticing, what are those physiological warning signs, like feeling a tightness in your chest or feeling like your face is flush and hot? Or what are some of the behavioral things that you typically do? Being more animated or pounding a fist or raising your voice. Take note of those things. Let them become your early warning signs that you're headed down a path that you don't want to go. Let me share another story with you from my personal life. My ex-wife and I used to argue, and very typically those arguments would escalate and get even more heated between us. Now, there was one time that we were starting into that pattern of arguing and escalating the argument, and her phone rang. She spent about 10 minutes talking on the phone. When she got off, rather than our argument continuing to escalate as it typically did, we had both calmed down and we were able to have a constructive dialogue about whatever the issue was. So that was a big lesson for me, and it can also be a strategy for you. If we want to avoid escalating into rage and into doing those things that we regret, where our behavior is just being driven by our fight or flight limbic brain, we could put some time into those situations. Even with 10 minutes gone by, my emotions had drained off considerably. I was able to think more clearly and more rationally. And our conversation and our ability to resolve the conflict increased dramatically.
I know it seems like something happens. Someone says something or does something, and we can immediately get into that rage reaction. But when we look closely, I think you'll see that there are steps that escalate us up to that state of mind. These are the warning signs that we talked about earlier. By catching ourselves earlier and inserting time, we prevent that escalation all the way to rage. The earlier we catch ourselves, the easier it is to change direction, the less damage we do to our relationships, and the more likely we are to arrive at a good solution. With practice, we can notice those early warning signs earlier and earlier, and more consistently avoid our very worst reactions.
In short, by putting time into those situations, we're able to get much better results and avoid the worst, most damaging behavior that typically happens when we allow that argument to continue to escalate. Now that you know how important inserting time is to interrupt an escalating conflict, how can you be intentional about inserting time into those situations? I want to introduce you to something called a timeout plan. This is a technique that will help us slow things down and to re engage rational parts of our brain for a better outcome. Now, the timeout plan has some very specific provisions. And what I can tell you is that all of those provisions are in there for a reason. In fact, there's some risk that the timeout plan won't work at all, or it could even backfire if we ignore parts of those provisions. So let's talk through the timeout plan, what it involves, and how you can execute it well. The first provision of the timeout plan is, if possible and safe to do so, discuss the timeout plan with your partner in advance before you need it. Now, we make this recommendation because it will let your partner know what you'll be doing when you call timeout. That makes it easier for them to accept and less likely to interfere with you actually calling the timeout and following through with the rest of the plan. It's easy for our partners to feel abandoned or fearful that their voice is not going to be heard, or you're trying to end the relationship, you're never coming back if you take a time out and they don't know about the plan. So tell them about it ahead of time. It makes it easier for them, which makes it easier for you. Second provision of the timeout plan is to identify your own signs that you're becoming angry in advance. This is the work that we talked about earlier in the session. It's identifying those physiological things that are happening in your body, or maybe the behavioral things, the patterns of actions that you typically do when you're becoming angry. Make sure that you have a good grasp of what those are and that you can identify those when they're happening. The third provision is, at the first sign of anger, at the first time you recognize any of those early warning signs, take the time out then. This is really important. It's a little bit like leaving the barn door open and the horses escape. It's a whole lot easier to round up the horses when they're really close to the barn door than after they've already headed for the hills. And the same thing is true with our emotions. The earlier we catch them, the easier it is to bring them back to a more steady state. The easier it is to catch that we need a timeout. Taking a timeout is not the same as giving in or being weak. On the contrary, it's actually a sign of great emotional control and a sign of strength. Number 4, focus on your own emotions. When you call a timeout, focus on what you're feeling, not your partner. And even if your partner is becoming upset, or even if they're more upset than you are, you're relatively calm compared to them, still state it in a way that focuses on your emotions. I'm feeling upset. I'm starting to feel flooded. I need a timeout. Rather than telling our partner that they need a timeout, which never goes over well. Make it about you and your own emotions. That's always easier for our partner to hear. And they can never really logically argue that we're feeling upset. We're the only one that can know that. Number 5, tell your partner where you're going. This is another one of those things that we can do to reassure our partner that we're not going someplace dangerous, we're not going to be hurt, that you're in fact coming back and you will have that discussion with them. It helps alleviate their fear that something bad has happened to us and will help them allow us to get out the door. Number 6, tell your partner how long you're going to be gone. We really recommend a minimum of 45 or maybe 60 minutes. During this time, adrenaline is going to be burning off, and our brain is going to be switching from that lizard brain mode, which is probably still going to be engaged for the first 30 minutes. Once the hormones go down and the emotions start to drain away, then we still need some time to plan, how are we going to best handle this situation? What is it that I'm feeling? What is it that I'm thinking? What are the thoughts that created those strong emotions? How can I address those? And ultimately, how can I return to our discussion in a solid way, in a calm way, where I can listen and communicate without getting flooded with my emotions again? If you call time out and it's hours or days or weeks, if ever, that you get back to that conflict, that's not a good strategy. It's called stonewalling, and that's actually another form of abuse, is to control or manipulate the situation so that you just don't deal with problems, and we try to win those conflicts by just shutting the other person down. It causes a lot of damage to relationships, so I would highly, highly discourage you from taking too long a time. You want to give yourself enough time for the emotions to drain away, for your thinking brain to kick in, but not so long that it just frustrates your partner. Number 7, tell your partner that you would like to hear his or her point of view, and that the two of you can discuss whatever your conflict was about when you return. Again, this reassures your partner that you do intend to talk to them about the issue. Their voice, their opinion matters, and you intend to hear them out. Number 8, leave in a respectful way. To the extent that you can, get out the door in a matter-of-fact way without saying anything more that's damaging, without slamming the door, without making a big show. That's certainly going to set the tone for when you return. Grab your jacket, get your shoes on, whatever you need to get out the door, but get out as quickly as possible too. I tell people that it's a little bit like your house is on fire. You don't want to spend too much time getting out the door collecting your belongings, changing your clothes, anything like that. Number 9, this is important, return when you said you would. Now, if in fact you need more time, it's fine to contact your partner then and say, I'm still needing to cool down, and can you give me a few more minutes or another half hour or something like that, so that I can still come back and have a good conversation with you about it. It's okay to buy a little bit more time here, but it is absolutely important that you get back and you have that discussion. What this shows is that you're dependable. And even if our partners resist the idea of us taking a time out, by consistently returning when we said we would and engaging in that conversation, having that discussion with them that caused the conflict, will show them that this is a good technique and that this is really helpful to your relationship. So do your part, be dependable, and actually return when you said you would. Once you've made your timeout plan and maybe talk to your partner about it, I want to encourage you to practice it. At the very least, visualize yourself doing it. But even better yet, actually practice taking a time out, even if you don't need it. This will make it easier for you to do when you do need that time. So, I'm going to practice right now, taking a time out. Now that I'm out practicing my timeout, let's talk about what to do and not to do while we're on a timeout. First, I recommend that you definitely get out. Don't stay, go to the bedroom and lock the door, or the garage or the basement. You want to get out because if you and your partner stay in close proximity to each other, it just makes it too easy for you to get back and re-engage. So definitely get out. I also recommend that you do what I'm doing, walk. Walking helps us burn off the adrenaline. The fresh air certainly helps us clear the mind. What I recommend that you don't do is to try to drive. Being upset, emotionally charged, angry, and then getting behind the wheel of a car, that's probably not a good idea. I strongly suggest too that you be alone. Don't call your buddy, your friend, your mom, your sister, your brother. This is a really good time for you to just be alone with your thoughts. Help clear your mind. I think it's important to consider what to think about while we're on our timeout as well. If we think about how wronged we were, how unfair that argument was, and then we start adding to it all of the other things that we thought were wrong and unfair, or we start thinking about all of our partner's flaws, we're just going to go back and feel even more emotionally charged, even worse than probably when we left. And that's not the objective. As an alternative, I suggest thinking about what you like and love about your partner. There's a reason why you got together to start with, so think about some of those reasons. You might also think about your partner compassionately. We all come into our relationships with a certain amount of baggage, emotional wounds from our past, things that we're overly sensitive to. So to the extent that you can see your partner that way and have compassion for them, that really helps us give them grace and helps us listen to them, maybe through their hurt, and hear the real issue or the real concern that they're trying to talk to us about. Then also be thinking about how can you best respond to your partner when you go back. Try to think through what they're really trying to say. What are they really feeling? Rather than thinking about how to win the argument, think about how can you make this a win-win for both of you. Not to the extent that you're giving up something that's really important to you, but how can you help your partner feel heard, understood, make them feel a little better, compromise a little bit. That will go a long way to building and strengthening the relationship and resolving things when you go back. So I hope this has helped, talking about what to do and not do, what to think about and not think about while you're on your timeout.
Here's your assignment for this week. Like with the last session, I want you to notice those times when you become upset or angry or you have a conflict with someone. And then write down afterwards answers to these questions. Jot down the date and what happened. Maybe just a few notes about what the conflict was about or what the situation was and how you reacted. Then try to identify the emotion that you felt at that time. Finally, write down what you believe your thoughts were that created that emotion. By continuing to do this exercise, what you'll notice is you gain better awareness of what's going on in your mind. And when we get to that level, then we're much able to make some changes that will really impact our behavior. Now here's the second part of your assignment for this week. What I want you to do is to create and practice a timeout plan. Think through all of the components that we talked about of a timeout plan. Like figure out where you're going to go and how long you're going to be gone. If you have a chance, talk to your partner about this timeout plan. And then finally, I encourage you to practice this timeout plan. If you can, actually take a practice timeout and get out, go for a walk, and just review the types of things that you want to be thinking about during your timeout. At the very least, envision yourself doing this. By practicing either in your mind or actually by taking a practice timeout, we're more likely to pull it off well when we actually need it.
Let's review the ground that we've covered in this session. We started off talking about rage. Rage is that state of mind that is out of control anger, where we're literally not thinking, but just reacting. We also covered a little bit about brain anatomy, and we talked about our limbic region of the brain that's responsible for those actions. The limbic brain is providing a reaction that's really pretty limited in its choices. It either fights or it tells us to flee. While a fight or flight reaction may seem inevitable, there actually are some things that we can do to interrupt that whole process so that we have more choices and more variety in our potential responses. Part of our job is to figure out what are our early warning signs that tell us that we're headed towards that dangerous rage reaction and that we need to step in and do something different so we don't go down that road. And then we talked about what we can do to interrupt that. And really the key is to insert time. I shared with you some guidelines for taking a time out. And when you took the time out with me, my practice time out, hopefully you picked up some good ideas of do's and don'ts of what to do and not do on your timeout, and also what to think about or possibly what not to think about during that timeout. I hope this material has been helpful to you. It is such an honor to be part of this journey with you. I really encourage you to practice your timeouts, to continue to dig into the material. Great job for working hard and focusing on what you need to do to make important changes in your life. I'll see you next time.